Now we're going to get into the research. As the governor mentioned, Chris Lineberger did research on ranking economic and social equity performance in the DC metropolitan area. Chris's research is the basis for the discussion today. He will present his findings, and then we'll have a discussion with Charlie Hewlett, Managing Director of RCLCO, and Dr. Richard Green, Director of the Luss Center of University of Southern California. It supports the mega trends Governor Glendening just discussed. I'd like to have Charlie Hewlett come up and set the stage for this discussion. Charlie.
It is my pleasure to play the role of moderator here for a distinguished panel. My two guests, Chris Lineberger, we've heard a lot about already, and Dr. Richard Green. They're going to each make a brief presentation, and then I'm going to attempt to moderate, I won't say referee, moderate a conversation between them and also with you, the audience. So I would like you all to think about questions and comments as the conversation progresses, but hold those to the end because I do want to get you involved in that conversation. So I'm going to start first and introduce our two panelists, first starting with Chris Lineberger. Chris is a former colleague of mine from RCLCO. That was many gray hairs ago, but in all fairness, I started going gray at the age of 25, so perhaps it isn't all that long ago. Chris has worn a number of hats. You've heard about a few of them. First as a consultant and real estate advisor, also as a developer, focusing on new urbanist and walkable urban development. Chris started and ran the University of Michigan's graduate program for real estate, focusing on walkable urban development. He's an author of numerous articles you all probably have read in places like The Atlantic and Urban Land, the New York Times, etc. He is also the author of a book entitled The Option of Urbanism. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he is currently the president of Locus, which is a real estate advocacy organization that's affiliated with the Smart Growth America, and also, as you heard, a co-sponsor of this conference, so thank you for that. As Dean Guthrie indicated, Chris is one of his newest hats here is a professor here at GW. Chris is the Charles Benedict Distinguished Scholar and Research Professor of Urban Real Estate at the George Washington University School of Business. And in his official capacity at GW Center for Real Estate and Urban Analysis, Chris is the author of DC, the Walk-Up, Wake-Up Call, which we're going to hear more about here in just a few minutes. So please join me in welcoming Chris Lineberger, first of all.
I think all of us remembered just a few minutes ago where we were 11 years ago. And it's important to note that the three targets of the terrorists were all walkable urban places. Downtown New York, the Pentagon, and the third place that they did not hit, of course, Capitol Hill. And ultimately, there are a lot of opposition forces to walkable urban places. Some from the left, mainly from the right, but we do know that terrorists always strike walkable urban places. So we've got our opposition to what we're talking about here today. But it really is just a remarkable trend that we're seeing throughout the country. My wife and I moved back here 6 years ago from Santa Fe, and we could live any place in the country, and for that matter, we were thinking about Europe. But from my Robert Charles Lesser and Company days, all my research kept on showing over the last 10, 15 years that Metro DC was the model. This was where the country was heading. 20, 30 years ago, when I first got into real estate, it was Atlanta and Los Angeles. Those were the models by which we were building the country, but it really became obvious to me that it was Metro DC. So we moved here because I wanted to be in the middle of the action. Wanted to see the future unfold within walking distance. And by the way, one of Doug's great recruiting tools that he used on me to get me to come to GW and leave the University of Michigan was, Lineberger, you live 9 blocks away from the campus. And so that obviously fit quite well with what I was up to. But when I also moved here and I was working at Brookings, and I did a survey in 2007 looking at the top 30 metro regions in the country as far as the number of walkable urban places per capita. And by far, number one was Metro DC. So I actually had some numbers to demonstrate this. The very first phone call I got from the press was from the New York Post. And they were yelling at me, saying, "How dare you, you DC-centric researcher. New York's, of course, the most walkable urban place in the entire country." And my response was, yes, Manhattan, no question, the finest walkable urban place in the country, probably not to be repeated because just extreme density. But that's where about 10% of you live in the 20 million person metro region that sprawls over 4 states. And so yes, 10% of you live like Seinfeld, but the other 90% live like Tony Soprano. And what the research also brought up was that we in social science have always been dividing the world into city versus suburbs. And that this is a center city versus all those outlying suburbs battle. When in fact it is a completely obsolete set of ways of looking at the built environment. And it was because of the US Census that we started looking through those lenses, because the US Census lays out all the data that we use from them between the principal city and outlying counties. But really, as you'll see today, there's only 2 ways of building the built environment: walkable urban and drivable suburban. Now within those 2 ways, there's lots of variations, but those are the 2 basic ways. And they have nothing to do with city boundaries. That drivable suburban places like the Palisades in the district certainly exist, just as drivable suburban places exist in McLean. And walkable urban places like DuPont Circle obviously exist in the district, but walkable urban places exist in Boston and Reston Town Center and Bethesda and Silver Spring as well in the suburbs. So it always reminds me of that social science joke, which was the drunk that was coming out of the party, lost his keys at the front door, and he stumbled down to the curb under the streetlight looking for his keys. And he's asked, "So why are you looking here? You didn't lose your keys here." And he said, "Well, this is where the light is." And that's how social science has been working, because that's where the data is. That's where we've been focusing most of our attention. As you can see, social scientists have a wicked sense of humor. So what I want to lay out is about walkable urban places, what we have now come to call walk-ups. And this is from Christine Patton. Christine Patton is responsible for the report that you'll be getting at lunchtime that summarizes this. Brilliant, creative lady who replaced the other acronym for walkable urban places, which was WHOOPS. And I think you'll see that walk-ups is a far better shorthand for this. But walkable urban places, or walk-ups, are also similar to what the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments call activity centers. And this is, these activity centers are around which their entire planning for the future is taking place. And walk-ups are also the heart of my work that I do as president of Locus, as we do work on Capitol Hill, on the transportation bill, on as far as on a tax reform. And 3 of my Locus colleagues, Christopher Coase, Jay Corbelis, and Zach Smith, are here if you want to learn more about how you can help change infrastructure and also change public policy about how we build the built environment. So I want to cue the slides and welcome you to the future of how we're going to build not only this metropolitan area, but the country in general. Because walkable urban places is the future, and DC is the model. Now, first off, you have to understand that the built environment, real estate, and the infrastructure that supports real estate is 35% of the asset base of the country. It's the largest asset class. And we in real estate, of course, are very proud of the fact that we work in the largest asset class, and we are always reminded of it because we both energize economic recoveries, but we've also caused 2 of the last 3 recessions. and we're very proud of that. And the reason that we're bumping along at 2% growth in this country is primarily because this 35% has not been re-engaged. And it's primarily because we've not figured out as an industry how to build walkable urban places. The thing is that back in the 20s and 30s, we built walkable urban places. It was only after the war that the pendulum swung all the way over to build drivable suburban. And the market wanted it, and we in real estate gave the market what it wanted. Unfortunately, we tended to overbuild, as you in real estate know, that we in real estate can overbuild any market no matter how good it is. We will overbuild it and collapse it. And I think you can see this time in this recession, we really did it. We really overbuilt it pretty dramatically. So in the second half of the 20th century, as we were putting in place this drivable suburban way of building, we of course started with the freeways, and then what followed were regional malls and drivable suburban subdivisions. We only got better at building freeways, and we know what it therefore led to. And over the last, during the last half of the 20th century, for every 1% population growth in this country, we tended to have somewhere between 6 and 8% land use consumption, a geometric increase in land use consumption, otherwise known as sprawl. But we had no shortage of land. We in this country, we stole the land fair and square, and we have a lot of it. And so what we would do is we would build upon it, throw it away, and keep on moving out. But now the pendulum is moving back over towards demanding more walkable urban places. It started somewhere in the mid-90s. And so when you take a look at these two ways of building, drivable suburban along the bottom of this matrix and walkable urban, the thing is that there's also two ways that a place plays a role in the regional economy. One place is a local serving place. These are bedroom communities. The other way is a regionally significant place. This is where jobs concentrate. This is where civic functions concentrate. One-of-a-kind museums and sports venues come. So two kinds of economic roles for place, two kinds of ways that they take different urban forms. So you have a simple 4-cell matrix. And of course, over the last 50, 60 years, we've been focusing on building what the market wanted, drivable suburban. And either they were edge cities, Joe Garreau's term, and of course, Tyson's Corner was the poster child for a drivable suburban edge city, or we had all the bedroom communities that were out there as we were pushing the growth boundaries out to West Virginia and out into Prince William County. Now, the walkable urban kind of places occupy far less land. In this metropolitan area, roughly 90% of our land use is drivable suburban. Only 10% probably is walkable urban. I say probably because the research I'm going to be laying out today is focused on one kind of walkable urban places. I have not yet studied the walkable urban local serving places. These are the Cleveland Parks and Shirlingtons and Falls Churches of this region that probably take up 8, 9% of the landmass of the region. But what I have focused on, and I'll be presenting today, and of course is in this report, are the regionally significant walkable urban places. These are the places that I believe the future of our economy is going to locate. And as you'll see, much of it already does locate there today. So there's 6 kinds of walk-up, or 6 types of walk-ups throughout this region. Of course, downtown, the traditional downtown, all metropolitans have at least one. We actually have basically 2, downtown and the Golden Triangle. The downtown adjacent places, these are places that are right around the downtown. Think of downtown as the aircraft carrier, and then there's a bunch of support ships around it. Lower density, generally speaking, different character. DuPont Circle here is shown. And then we have urban commercial. These are places that back in the early 20th century were a local serving drag, U Street and H Street. And then over the last 10, 15 years, they've reemerged as having a regionally significant function. Adams Morgan, of course, comes to mind. And that's U Street. So here is downtown, one of the 6 kinds of walk-ups. This research now shows that downtowns in this region, 83% are in fact office dominated, which of course is no surprise. Only 1% of downtown is retail. And yet we're beginning to get that vitality of retail on the street, and it's only 1%. And we're also seeing great increases in residential in downtown, but that's only 6%. So we've not known these numbers before, and one of the great questions that we always ask is, what's the right product mix? Well, the answer is we have a lot of opinions. We don't know for certain what is the right product mix, but now we begin to have some numbers, and we can begin to measure these places to see, and someday in the future understand what is the best product mix. Downtown adjacent places are still office dominated, but here we have much more housing. About 24% is housing. And here in these downtown adjacent places, 4% is retail. So, I mean, think about it. DuPont Circle, great urban entertainment, great buzz. Only 4% of it is retail. It doesn't take much to make a great walkable urban place. And then urban commercial. These are much more residentially dominated. And here they have 15% retail. And that's really is their reason for existence. So then, those were the center city places. There's also 3 types out in the suburbs. And so we have a suburban town center, places like Bethesda that were 18th, 19th century town centers that got absorbed into the metropolitan region. The next are strip commercial redevelopment. This is where we're going to see more redevelopment and more and just more square footage development than any other place over the next 30 years. And of course, the big models here, the big movers, are White Flint, which we're going to be hearing from later on in the afternoon, and Tysons. Tysons is the model, of course. It's the largest suburban commercial concentration in the world. And they've chosen to go from being drivable suburban to walkable urban. And they're paying for it themselves, by the way. Not entirely, but partially. And then finally, greenfield developments. These are places that were greenfields and you just add water and poof, instant urbanity. The Post just wrote about greenfield developments in Sunday's paper. So the product mix there of both suburban town centers and also a strip commercial redevelopment tend to have the same product mix. Kind of surprising, and a lot of it is retail. They're in blue, 16%. Many of these are regional malls that have become urbanized. Think the Boston Commons Mall. And then, of course, the greenfield. And again, much of this tends to be office, but much more residential. And these are examples. And people complain about greenfields as being too sterile. That's what the Post's whole point was in the article this weekend, that these things are sort of Disney-fied. But there's a definite market segment that wants this really clean, somewhat pristine, somewhat prissy, walkable urban places. So where are they? And this research has shown that there are 43 regionally significant walk-ups in the region where the future of this economy is going to locate. It takes up 0.9% of the land mass of this region. It's 17,500 acres are comprising these 43 walk-ups. And of course, downtown is the first, and then the downtown adjacent places, again, surrounding the downtown, and then the urban commercial districts that are in the District of Columbia. And then you superimpose the suburban town centers, such as Wheaton and such as Silver Spring and Bethesda, Clarendon also. and then the strip commercial redevelopment. And interestingly about Tyson's, by the way, Tyson's, which is the largest one up there, is 2,400 acres. They're going to have 4 metro stations open towards the end of next year. It is undoubtedly that we're going to see 3, maybe 4 regionally significant places emerge out of Tyson's, each with their own character, each with their own target market. Because keep in mind that the entire Roslyn-Boston corridor is only about 1,200 acres. And Tyson's is twice as big, and in the Roslyn-Boston corridor, they have 5 walkable urban places. And then here are the greenfields, which include National Harbor, Reston Town Center, and Kentlands. And I classify Crystal City also as greenfield, even though it was technically a brownfield when it was developed. Now, the interesting thing about the growth trends in this country, and something that is important to know, that every metropolitan area in the country follows this pattern of growth, all during the late 20th century into the early 21st century, whether it's drivable suburban that was driving it or walkable urban. If you know 3 things about the metropolitan area, you can tell where the growth has gone. Number 1, if you know where the white upper middle income housing concentration is. Number 2, if you know where the local minority housing concentration is, tends to be on the other side of the metro region. And number 3, you know where the major transportation systems were built. You will know where the favored quarter is. The favored 90-degree arc coming out of downtown, and here it's in red. And in Atlanta, it grows to the north. In Denver, it grows to the south. In Phoenix, it grows to the northeast. And obviously here it grows to the northwest is where the favored quarter is. It is the reason behind the great east-west divide in this town that my colleague at Brookings, Alice Rivlin, wrote about 10 years ago, the great east-west divide in this region. That it's following a national trend of moving most investment, most job growth into the favored quarter. And that has been followed as we've been building walkable urban places too. The early walkable urban places in the late 90s and in the last decade have gone into the favored quarter, the red line and the orange line basically. Well, one of the most impressive things that's happening here, and this is why I wanted to move here, is that we're just now beginning to see growth go outside of the favored quarter. We're beginning to see it move into the northeast and into the southeast. In essence, the green line is the new red line. And I think this is one of the most important social and economic trends of our era. And it's going to really help bridge that east-west divide, I'm hoping. So let's look at some numbers. Where are these places, these 43 walkable urban places? Well, the interesting thing is that only 42% of them are in the District of Columbia, 49% of the total square footage. And that means 58% are in the suburbs, 51% of the total square footage. So this is not just the redevelopment of our center cities. This is the transformation of the suburbs. There's 4.1 billion square feet in our region. Now, there's a major asterisk here in this data set, that one of the things that we in social science do not know is where is what we call owner-user space located, such as this auditorium and GW itself, such as, the federal government, such as the corporate headquarters of Marriott, which is owned by Marriott. There is no data set that shows where that square footage is, how much it is, and how many people work there. Without, there's some, ways that you can twist and bend and find it, and I'm hoping that we can do that in future in future phases of this research. This research is basically comprised of spec space, single-family housing, office, retail, hotels, but not owner-user, and it would probably add at least 1 to 2 billion square feet more to this total. Of which a little less than 12% are in these regionally significant walk-ups. And then income-producing properties, cash-flowing properties, i.e. non-for-sale housing, is about 1/3 of this 4.1 billion. And of that income-producing property, walk-ups have 29% market share of the income-producing properties. But it varies by product type. When you take a look at the different kinds of product, obviously industrial does not tend to locate in walkable urban places. Industrial needs to be one level, truck or a train serviced, and so we're not seeing walkable urban industrial. What we are seeing is, of course, office and hotel being in these regionally significant walk-ups, but also look at there in the middle, rental residential. That's a really important one. Right now, it is only 14%, but I'll be showing you what's happening over time with that. Now, what's happening as far as how's it changing over time over the last 3 real estate cycles? And we really only have numbers back to the 1990s. We in real estate did not have great numbers prior to the 1990s because every time we had a recession, the people collecting all those numbers went out of business and all those numbers were trashed. Only with the rise of Wall Street's interest in real estate, starting in the early 1990s, was there demand for great, consistent national data on real estate. So in the 1990s, 24% of all development in this region went into regionally significant walk-ups. In 2000, it was 33%. And starting in 2009 with the current real estate cycle, weak as it is, 49% has been going into regionally significant walk-ups. Office space has been the driver of this. That in the 1990s, 38% of all office space went into these regionally significant walk-ups. In the 2000s, it was 49%, and in this real estate cycle, it's 59%. But the other one that's really important is rental apartments. Of course, rental apartments have been driving us out of this recession as far as real estate goes. 1990s, only 12% went into walkable urban places. In the 2000s, it was 19%. And in the and in this cycle, it's 42%. And this vastly understates what's actually happening. Because again, going back to what I said earlier, I have data only on regionally significant places, those 43 places. Much of the rental apartment development that's gone on has been going into local serving walkable urban places. If there is a typical development that's gone up in this town, in this region, over the last 3 years, it's been a 200-300 unit rental apartment project over a grocery store. And probably this number, if you added in local serving walkable urban places, along with the regionally significant, it'd probably be 70 or 80% of all rental apartments are in walkable urban places. So office rents also, what happens? Paris talked about all the surveys that we've seen and what people want. Well, it's one thing to look at surveys. It's another thing to see what people are willing to pay for. And with walkable urban places, there's a dramatic price premium on a price per square foot across the board. For office space, the average walkable urban office space is almost $37 per square foot in this region. For drivable suburban, it's about $21 per square foot. There's a 75% price premium. And anybody with gray hair here, like Charlie and myself, we know that back 20 years ago, that relationship was reversed. Tyson's was the place to be. Downtown was the place to get out of. I remember walking through downtown 20 years ago, coming back here to visit, and I really should have been running through downtown. And as Rich Bradley will say later on, that the brand of downtown was dangerous, dull, and dirty. And today, downtown is probably second only to Midtown Manhattan as far as a healthy, walkable urban place and downtown in this country. The other thing to note is that of all the rents generated for office space in this region, 68% of those rents are coming from walkable urban office space. And when you also layer on top of it that cap rates for walkable urban real estate result in a valuation increase of a valuation premium of 40%. That in essence, that square foot in a walkable urban place is worth 40% more than in a drivable suburban space. when you add that on top of this price premium, probably we're looking at 70 to 80%, 75 to 80% of all the value in the office field is in walkable urban places. So let's look at for sale for 1 second. For sale is 2/3 of the built environment. Where we all live is 2/3 of the square footage out there. And yet walkable urban places, it's only 3% of the total built environment. Now again, this ignores local serving walkable urban places, so it's probably closer to 10, 15% when you add that in, but we don't have those numbers yet. But the thing is that there's such pent-up demand to live in walkable urban places that the price premium on a price per square foot basis for a walkable urban townhouse or condo versus a drivable suburban place in this market is, again, over 70% on a price per square foot basis. For apples to apples basis, you'll pay 70% more for a walkable urban square foot than you will for a drivable suburban square foot. And that is, again, brand new. This is something I had in the New York Times a couple months ago, looking at Washington, and the red line is 1996, the West End, here, right here, in the West End, versus McLean, obviously a very high-end, drivable suburban place. And in 1996, the price premium for a square foot in McLean was about 25% over the West End. But look at it today. It's about that the lines have crossed. And today the West End is far more expensive than McLean. This is the market telling us in real estate something. And this is happening throughout the country. Here is Denver, where a near slum called the Highlands, right adjacent to downtown, similar to the West End here. When you compare it to Highlands Ranch, about 30 miles south, this is a golf course community, guard-gated golf course community. The Highlands had about a 25% price premium over the Highland back in 1996, and today Highland is about twice as expensive on a price per square foot basis as the drivable suburban competition. That's happening, those lines are crossing throughout the country. So some more numbers that you'll see in the report. Walk score is a very important thing. Walkability seems to be the major issue that people are looking for when they move to walkable urban places. Kind of makes sense. I've come up with a 4-level ranking system in ranking these places so we can compare them one to the other. And I've stolen from LEED, from a U.S. Green Building Council, their metal rankings. So I've ranked these 43 places according to 4 different scales. One is copper, silver, going up the scale, gold, and platinum. And as you can see, and you'll see in the report, that as you move up in economic performance, that it becomes more and more walkable. You probably know walk score, a scale of 0 to 100, and basically walkable urban places here start at about 70 and move up to the high 90s. As far as FAR, floor area ratio, which is a way of measuring density, you can see that these places gradually, and then towards the end, as you get to the highest ranked walkable urban places that are platinum ranked, they begin to get more and more density. Basically, density matters, something that the governor just spoke about. And of course, rents. This is the bottom line for all of us in real estate, that here's office, retail, rental, residential, and rental, and then for sale, convert it to rental, so it's an apples to apples comparison. So first was copper, showing you the rent per square foot, starting around $20, $25, $30 for each of these product types. Then here's the silver performance, jumping up quite dramatically. And then here is the gold performance, again, moving up. And then finally, the platinum performance. So you can see that we're seeing, as these places perform better, the rents are being driven up economically, and this is the overall ranking in all 4 of those product types. But, so what does it mean as far as bottom line? As you move from copper to silver, as far as the performance of your place, as you move from silver to gold, as you move from gold to platinum, as you are becoming a more highly productive place and you're becoming more walkable, you are also seeing, on average, your walk score go up 6 points. You're seeing your office rent go up over $7 per square foot, and that's $7 per square foot annually. Retail rent goes up nearly $7 per year. Rental apartments go up $6 per year, and for sale housing prices go up $113 per square foot for every level you move up. This is the market telling us we want more of this product. So when we stand back and look at the performance of this, I have a great senior researcher who's involved with me, Mason Austin, who has brought a great statistical focus on, so why does this stuff work? And there are three things that explain 90% of the variability of these results. That 2/3 of this is caused by walk score, the walkability of the place. If you add walk score and job density together, you explain almost 85% of the variability of these results. And if you combine walk score, job density, and the education levels of the workforce, how many people have graduated from college, you explain 90% of why these walkable urban places are performing so well. Now, there's another side to this. Just as Paris said, we have two ways of measuring these walkable urban places. One is economic, but the other is social equity. Can the ordinary Washingtonian live or have access to these walkable urban places? And the research shows something which is rather intuitive, is that as economic performance improves, the social equity goes down. So this is a challenge. Now that we have a measurement device, this is a challenge for us as an industry and for us from a public policy point of view and for us that are in the place management business of how do we offset this. So we had a series of measures of social equity. I'm not going to go into all of them, but again, copper, silver, gold, platinum. This is the housing and transportation costs. As the governor mentioned, it's not just their housing cost, it's how much you're spending on transportation. Because we know that the typical drivable suburban household in this region spends 25% of their household income on transportation. That's to maintain a fleet of cars. The typical walkable urban household spends 9% on transportation. And that's because they're walking or taking transit. And for every one car you drop out of a household, you can increase your mortgage capacity by $150,000. So what we're looking for are places where the housing and transportation costs are going down. And so one of the factors that we looked at with social equity is are we seeing a reduction in the median income that people have to spend to live in these walkable urban places? There's also a thing called a diversity index, which is randomly, what are the chances that the next person you meet will be different than you in ethnic background. And so we also rank these places, copper, silver, gold, and platinum, according to the diversity ratio. And as so as you move up the rank, you're more likely to see different people in these walkable urban places that have a higher social equity ranking. So why DC? Why is DC the model? Well, and of course, a lot of people say, well, DC can't be the model because the federal government's there. And the federal government, there's only one place that the federal government locates. Well, the fact of the matter is that every metropolitan area in this country has a unique economic base. That's the reason for its existence. With Seattle, it's building airplanes and software. In Detroit, it's cars. In Boston, it's higher education, the state capital, and high tech. Well, Washington happens to be the federal government, high tech, and now more and more corporate headquarters coming to locate here. So every place has a unique economic base. So if in fact you discount Washington, you're basically saying you can't learn lessons from any place because every place is unique, so there's nothing that can ever be learned. And I don't think that's true. But the other reason that DC is the model, I think, and this is a theory to be proven over the next 10, 20 years, the knowledge economy is what we're in the middle of. What does the knowledge economy require? Highly educated workforce. Metropolitan DC has the most highly educated workforce in the country and has had for many, many decades. In this graph, the blue line is from 1990 to 2010, the education level of this region, the number of adults over 25 that are college educated. And in 1990, it was about 38%, and it rose to 47% by 2010 in this region. The next 5 most walkable metros of the largest metros in the country are the red line. These are the Bostons, San Franciscos, Portlands, Seattles, Denvers. And those cluster of 5 metros that were the second most walkable to DC also had the second most, had the second highest concentration of college-educated folks. 30% in 1990, and by 2010, it was up to about 38%, where DC was 20 years ago. The yellow line is the nation as a whole, as well as the 5 metro areas that have the least walkability in the largest metro regions in the country. Just happen to be the exact same numbers. And it was 20% in 1990, and today it's just, in 2010, it's about nearly 30%, which was where that red line was 20 years ago. So what I think is conceivable, again, this is a theory, is that we are becoming a more educated society. Knowledge workers, the creative class, demand the option of urbanism, demand the ability to live in a walkable urban place if they so choose. And over the next 20 years, we're going to see the nation as a whole get better educated, sort of like those 5 metros I just talked about in red. Meanwhile, those 5 metros are also going to get better educated, sort of like DC. And then finally, between 2030 and 2050, we'll see the nation as a whole, basically, from a college education point of view, follow what DC has done over the last 20 years. So the creative class, the knowledge economy is driving this. It just so happened that DC got there first. That's one of the major reasons that we are a model for this trend. So what does it mean for all of us? It means that there's about 1 walk-up here in this region for every 130,000 people. I don't know if that's going to be the rule of thumb in the future, but at least that's where we are right now. Which means that there's about 7 to 8 walk-ups for every 1,000,000 people. So when I go to Detroit, I go to Seattle, I go to Atlanta, the big question is, where are the missing 20 or 30 regionally significant walk-ups that you don't have yet, which is going to put a foundation under their economy for the next generation? So in closing, this is a scatter plot that's in the report, taking these 2 metrics, economic performance and social equity performance, and putting the 43 walkable urban places into a scatter plot. The thing is that we want to be in the upper right-hand corner. We want to both have high economic performance and high social equity. That should be our goal, to be moving these walkable urban places into a position where we're both making a lot of money and it's socially equitable so that all of us can participate. So in closing, for today and in the future, walkable urbanism is becoming the market. Thank you very much.
I have a bit of a difficult assignment here because it's my job to be the heartless economist for a few minutes. And that's not always an easy thing to do, particularly since I was reflecting on what I missed most about Washington. I love living in Los Angeles. I think I'm going to stay there until they cart me away. But when I was thinking about what I most miss about Washington, it was in fact the fact that when I went to work, I could walk to the Red Line. I lived in Bethesda. Take the Red Line into work and walk to George Washington. And I actually took it to DuPont Circle, which isn't the closest stop, but I enjoyed the walk down New Hampshire Avenue as part of my morning. So I'm all into walking, walkability, all that kind of thing. But I also can't help thinking about the fact that I got a pretty heavy subsidy for riding that metro line to work every day. Automobiles get subsidies too, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But my colleague Tony Yaser here at George Washington showed me that the subsidy for riding the metro was much heavier than it would have been for driving my car. Now, again, that's okay because voters vote for these things, but I still sometimes can't help but think of the Onion headline that said that 98% of Americans agree that their neighbors should take transit to work. And that may be the reason why we vote for these things. Okay, but in general, from a personal standpoint, I have no hostility to walking whatsoever. So I'm going to organize my remarks in the following way, and I got a chance to read this study that I guess you're going to be given at noon today. So I'm going to say a few words about where I agree with what Chris just said. I'm going to say a few words where I have some disagreement. And then I want to talk a little bit about what urban economics says about urban form, how we're most likely to organize ourselves, and the implications of this for cities in the future. Okay, so let me start by I've already sort of said this, I agree, walking is good. You're not going to find me say, no, don't walk. It's a really bad thing to do. Okay. I also agree that we subsidize autos, or at least do not price their negative externalities well enough. And this is one of the great frustrations of being an economist, is if you ask economists what good taxes are, generally number 1 or 2 on the list is the gasoline tax. Greg Mankiw, who is one of Mitt Romney's economic advisors, he was one of George W. Bush's economic advisors, started a thing called the Pigou Club or the Pigou Society in order to have taxes that did something called internalized externalities, make people pay for the real cost of what they're doing. And the automobile tax is on the top 1 or 2 things on the list. Maybe a general carbon tax would be even a little better still. They are politically very unpopular. If you ask the American people what tax they hate most, it's the gasoline tax. And this, to me, if we're serious about cities changing their form, and we're not willing to have expensive driving, then, well, we're not really serious about having cities change their urban form. It's hard to see the font on this graph, but suffice to say that, see the bar on the right, on the far right there? That's U.S. gas prices in the United States compared to pretty much every other large country in the world. And so all you need to take away from this graph is we pay about half for gasoline what every other industrialized country in the world pays. There are some countries that pay about 3 times as much as we do. If we want people to walk, to use transit, to live closer together, to not drive, we got to make it expensive to drive. And there doesn't seem to be a political appetite to do that. So I don't see serious densification as being in our future unless we change this. And even then, there are going to be some issues that I'll talk about. Okay, where do I disagree? Chris made a statement that, well, it's all right to look at Washington as a template because all cities have unique economic bases, and so if you're going to say we can't learn from Washington, we can't learn from anyone else. And there's some truth in that, but there's a way in which Washington really is very different from other cities. This graph represents the ratio of jobs in a city, a central city, to population in a central city. So this is the municipality that's the center of a metropolitan area. Okay, and I picked 4, but I could have picked 20, and the other 19 would have looked the same other than Washington. You could see San Francisco, which is very similar to DC in that about 10% of the people in the Bay Area live in the city of San Francisco. Similarly, about 10% of people in the Washington metropolitan area live in the city of Washington, D.C. The ratio of jobs to population is a little over 50% in San Francisco. In Washington, D.C., it is 120%. Okay, New York and LA, it's in the low 40s. Now you could argue New York and LA are such big municipalities that they essentially have suburbs inside the municipalities, and there's some truth to that. But the point is, DC is an unusually monocentric city in terms of economic activity. Now that is, there are lots of big edge cities in DC too, but that center is really, really important in DC in a way that we don't see in any other large American metropolitan areas. The other thing I would argue is that DC's industrial structure requires face-to-face contacts more than most other cities' industrial structures do. So think about Detroit and automobiles. I guess they're making them there again. The people who make the parts really don't need to see the people who build the cars every day. Whereas the lawyers and lobbyists really do need to see the people on the Hill, the congressional staff people, and the people in the agencies every day. So I do think one of the reasons Washington has been successful in certain ways with respect to walkable communities and perhaps even transit is because its industrial structure really is unique in two important ways. Its monocentricity and the nature of the industry that it has. I also disagree that I think banal, and this is my word, not his, suburbs have their place. So this is Levittown in 1948, sort of the mother of all suburban subdivisions. What do I like about this? I mean, I'm a snob. I would never live in one of these places myself. It was really cheap to build. Okay, the cookie cutter, ticky-tacky, essentially manufacturing process house is a really inexpensive house. And one of the issues I have with the presentation is there's this view that these walkable places create economic activity because they have higher rents. But until you compare the rents to the cost, it's really hard to say what you have in terms of feasibility. And this was a revolution in that it provided houses very cheaply to people. We're seeing this, by the way, in Mexico and Brazil now. People building not particularly distinguished houses, but perfectly serviceable houses that provide low-income people with electricity, with sewer, with water, with a decent standard of living at a very low cost. And I think it's very easy when we think about things like walkable communities and densification to forget about cost. Okay, here's what I still don't know. Do walk-up communities actually add value? Okay, so we saw some impressive statistics about rent premia and changes in rent premia. And in Washington, D.C., the change really is remarkable. But again, is it the walkability of Washington, or is it the fact that 20 years ago what Washington was, and Chris mentioned this too, I'm glad he did, this was a dysfunctional city. This was a really unpleasant, I'd actually say more like 25 years ago. I think, since I don't live here, I could say it, I think Tony Williams did an amazing job as mayor here. I think governance improved dramatically here. We did some projects, Susan Phillips, who was my dean here, with the city government, where they found records on the basement floor from previous administrations that Tony Williams and Nat Gandhi had students come in and clean up so they could actually know what was going on. Washington is really transformed as a city, and so it's become a much more attractive place to live. And I don't know how much that is responsible for the rent premium versus, say, the physical structure of the city. Similarly, I look at where the walkable communities are. These are really desirable locations for a whole host of reasons. Let me throw out one example of why it's a problem identifying what's going on here. I and some co-authors did a series of regressions to try to figure out housing values in different cities around the country. And one of the things we found in Washington, D.C. is, unlike other cities, the most valuable houses in Washington, D.C., after controlling for other characteristics, were houses built in the 1930s. Okay, now, do I think 30s construction was necessarily better than the stuff before, the stuff after? I mean, remember, stuff before is Georgetown, for example. No, not really. It's those 30s houses were built for workers who were coming to Washington for the New Deal and then the Defense Department for World War II. They're the early 1940s, and they were in really great locations for people to get to work with the federal government. So until there's some mechanism for identifying the impact of location per se, as opposed to the built environment, it's really hard to know how much these add in value. And I find it entirely possible that they add value, but I'm not yet convinced. Okay, just some final remarks. What does urban economics say about how cities look with respect to urban form, demographics, affluence, public goods, and zoning? Well, the first thing is, this is from my friend Lineberger, who was a planner at the World Bank for many years. If we look at cities around the world, the form of these cities is pretty much the same. It is remarkably the same. Is you have lots of density in the center, and then it falls off on the periphery. The only exception to this are heavily planned cities, like Curitiba in Brazil, the cities of the former Soviet Union, and the worst cases are apartheid cities in South Africa, where you have actually low density in the center and high density on the periphery, because apartheid reserved the center for white people. The scale is different from city to city. The one on the lower left-hand side is Atlanta, and it's much less dense than other places. But as you can see, that basic shape is the same from city to city. And these cities range from Shanghai to New York to Atlanta to Krakow. These are cities from all over the world. Again, I'm not trying to mislead in any way other than the planned cities that I mentioned. They all look pretty much like this. And so this higher density in central places is a feature everywhere, and of course that means greater demand leads to higher value. Demographics, okay, some things we know. Population increases tend to increase density, no surprise there. But we've been seeing households get smaller, as Chris noted, and that tends to decrease density. What I really don't know is what happens when more married couples are working. So you have a husband, a wife, kids at home, both are working. It's difficult to say what the impact is on density. You could actually tell a story either way, but it does have an impact on transport mode. And I think this is one of the reasons cars became so appealing, is when you have to get your kid to school and maybe to the doctor in the middle of the day and go to work, then the car becomes its flexibility becomes much more appealing relative to other forms of transit. The revolution in women working likely had an impact on transit mode or transportation mode to work, and I don't see that changing particularly in the years to come. As people get richer, they tend to move out of the middle of cities. Again, we see this in countries around the world. Paris is the most desirable city in the world in my view, and yet if you look at Paris's population share inside the periphery, going back to World War II, it's been decreasing steadily as Parisians have gotten richer. As transport costs become less of a burden, the affluent move further out to consume less expensive land. If housing is a normal good, more income means more housing per person. If driving is a normal good, more income produces more driving. The paradoxes of Paris and New York, okay, again, the center city has lost population share over the years, but they become more expensive. The rich live in these places. Well, that's because part of transportation cost is time, and when you have bad congestion, then there is a powerful incentive for rich people to live in the middle of cities and actually drive out lower income people. We see that in San Francisco as well. Whether this is a good thing or not depends a lot on your point of view about gentrification. Public goods, we know that schools have been driving settlement patterns for years. There's a long literature that school quality dominates all other public goods in capitalization. Again, Montgomery County, Maryland, compare it to Prince George's County, Maryland, right next door. They have similar locational characteristics along the boundary, but you have much greater value on one side of the border than the other. I think it begs an interesting question as we think about the future growth of cities is, should different parts of the metropolitan area specialize in different stages of the life cycle? So I think about here in Washington, D.C., I learned from Bob Abel, who worked for the city, was chief economist for the city for some years, that if you look at the number of married couples with children filing tax returns in the District of Columbia, it's about 5% of all tax returns. Okay, nationally, that number would be 25 to 30%. Okay, what's going on? Well, if you can afford not to live in the district because of the schools with kids, you live somewhere else in the metropolitan area. If you're single or if you don't have kids anymore, the district's a wonderful place to live now. Okay, obviously there have been a lot of national headlines about trying to reform schools in the district, but it almost begs the question, well, is the district really a place for people to live in their 20s and in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it should maybe give up on people living in their 30s, 40s, and 50s here. I know that's probably not a very nice thing to say, but maybe different places have different purposes in people's life cycles. We certainly know schools are incredibly important drivers of where people locate within metropolitan areas. To me, one of the biggest problems, if you're thinking about the issue of how do you have walkability and social equality, is the issue of exclusionary zoning. It's hard to overcome. Part of it is there's a perception that attached housing attracts high demand for public services. There's a suburb immediately to the south of where I live in Los Angeles called San Marino that does not have a single multifamily building in the entire city. This is not by accident. It turns out the opposite is true. Multifamily housing tends to demand less in the way of public services. More generically, the desire to keep housing expensive in order to keep out undesirables. This is an unfortunate thing that we see. And note, I'm putting quotation marks around undesirables. That's not how I feel about it. More than anything else, in my view, this has distorted the shape of cities. And yet, we still have it in lots and lots of places. Final point, my next slide, though, again, just show that I don't have any hostility to density. We do have more room for density. This, again, back to Ellen Bertot's number. This is density by cities around the world. The colors reflect continents. So blue are Asian cities. Mumbai is a city that has roughly, 20 times the density of Washington, D.C. So Washington has a long way to go. The interesting thing, the densest North American city there is New York. Is about 1/10 the density of Mumbai. It's about half the density of many European cities. And the final thing I can't help but point out, you probably can't see this, again because of the fonts, but Los Angeles, sprawl city, is actually a denser place than Washington, D.C. is as a metropolitan area. So I want to leave a few minutes for questions. Thanks for having me back to George Washington.